Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, we're going to create global state in a React application using only React and React hooks. But before we dive in and actually walk through the process of how to set this up, I want to quickly talk about what the final project looks like. So here in the code, we are in our app.js file, which is our main application. And this is where all of our components are for our application. Now you'll see at the top that we have this global state provider that we're wrapping around our entire application. And these components here, we're not passing any props or defining any state values here in our app.js file. We're all defining them here in our provider. And then these components can read off of them using context and also change the state value by dispatching some type of action type and then handling that in a reducer, which we'll set up here in just a few moments. Now, to quickly just walk you through this, right now the user is logged out, and this login button isn't real authentication, it's just to simulate the process. And because this user is not logged in, this download button is disabled and this login notification is being displayed. Now once we log in, we're now displayed the log out button. That notification goes away, and now we can click on this button to download the image. All right, so now that you have a brief idea of what we're going to be doing, let's head to CodeSandbox and set up our project. So I'm going to go to codesandbox.io, go ahead and close out of this, come down to Create Sandbox, and then click here on React. Now, if you don't see this in your recently used, you can either scroll down and find it in your official templates or search for it here by just typing in React and clicking on this one. And this is going to build us a basic boilerplate React application. Now to start, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and get rid of this H2 tag. And let's change this H1 tag to say something different. Maybe just download image. All right, so now that we did that really quick change, let's go ahead and set up our global state provider, which is going to allow us to have that global state. So now that we changed that, let's go ahead and set up our global state provider. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come into this source folder here, and I want to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder store. Now inside this store folder, I'm going to create a couple files here. Now the first one I'm going to create is going to be context.js. Create another one here. This one's going to be the global state provider.js. And the last one is going to be the useGlobalState.js file. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to initialize context or create the context. And this context is going to be blank here in this file, but essentially what this is doing is it's telling our React application like, hey, here's the context that we want to use. And you can think of context as just this like empty object that holds some type of value. Now right now it's empty, but we're actually going to be passing in some initial state and dispatch in the rest of the code. But here, this is really simple just to get this initialized. So what we want to do is we first want to import create context, and we're importing that directly from React. Then we can go ahead and we can define our context here. So const context equals create context, and we're just going to pass in an empty object. And then to get access to this in our other files, we need to export this. So export default context. And that's it. That's all we're going to be doing in this context.js file. So let's go ahead and close that out. Now the next one we want to work in is this useGlobalState. Now in the useGlobalState, what we want to do is we want to import useReducer from React. Now if you use React hooks, you may have used useState. I think that's probably the most common one that people learn first. And the useReducer is very similar to useState, but what we do here is we can set up a state and action, and we're also going to be setting up a reducer. And what this is going to do is it's going to dispatch something to our reducer. We're going to pass in an action type. So let's say, for instance, login is the action type. We're then going to use a switch statement that says, hey, this action type is this. What do you want me to do to the state? So let's go ahead and import useReducer. And we're going to be importing that from React. Then we can define our reducer at the top. So let's do const reducer. equals, we're going to be passing in the state, and we're also going to be passing in an action. And then we'll write our arrow function like this, and then we'll write a switch statement. Now what we're going to be looking at is the action.type. So once we pass this in, we can pass in a value on that action called type, and then this type can look at what that case is and then handle how we change the state accordingly. So let's go ahead and handle our first state, or excuse me, our first case. Our first case is going to be login. Now you don't have to do it in all caps like this. This is just a convention that I like to stick to. You'll also see other people do it this way as well. And for case login, we want to return is logged in. We want to set that to true. And for the next case, so case log out, we want to return is logged in and set that to false. Now, because this is a switch statement, we also need to define a default value. So default is just going to return the state. And I don't need semicolons there. Not sure why I did that. All right, so now that we defined our reducer, we're going to create a custom hook called useGlobalState, which we're going to then export and use in our provider as the value. So in order to create this hook, we first have to define it. So const useGlobalState, and this is just going to be an arrow function. And here is where we're going to define useReducer or use useReducer. Now the first value in useReducer is going to be the state value. Then the next one is going to be dispatch. And then we call useReducer, passing in the reducer that we just defined and then initializing the initial state. So the way you write that is first here, defining our state. Now you might see this just called state, but I like to call this global state because it is a global property that we're going to be using throughout our application. And I also like to do the same thing here for dispatch. So global dispatch. Here is where we call useReducer. The first thing we want to pass in is the reducer that we just defined above. And we also want to define the initial state. And the only state that we have right now is logged in, and we want that to be set to false. All right, so now that we define that, all we want to do now is return the global state in the global dispatch right here. So we're going to define that here. So global state, global dispatch. And last, we need to export default useGlobalState, because out of this, we're going to be using this in our context that we're just about to define. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to create our global state provider. So let's come into our global state provider here. Oops, there we go. And we want to import React. Oops, I'm not sure how I split that. From React. And we also want to import the useGlobalState that we just created. And that's going to be in the same folder, useGlobalState. And last, we want to import the context that we've created first. And now we can go ahead and create our provider. So let's do const global state provider. This is just the name of the provider. You can name it anything you want. This is going to be another arrow function. We're going to pass in children here, and you'll see what that means here in just a second. So let's go ahead and finish our function. And this is going to return context provider, and then we pass in some value. So in this case, it's just going to be calling that useGlobalState here. Then we can close this off. We want to pass the children in. So what this is that anything we pass in between this global state provider is just going to be rendered out here in this children. So now we just need to just close this off with the context provider. And then we need to export this so we can then wrap our application in it. So export default global state provider. All right, so all the setup is now done. So let's make sure we just save that. And then we need to come into our application and then wrap it in that new global state provider. And to do that, just come over here above the app, say global state provider, and you can see that auto imported. We can close that off, and then we need to have the end tag. So let's copy this, come down here below this div, and make sure that is a closing tag. All right, so now if we go ahead and save this, let's go ahead and open this into a new tab here, come down to inspect, and I have the React DevTools installed into my Chrome here. And at the top here in our tree, you can see the global state provider. And the global state provider has the global state with our reducer, and it also has this is logged in state, which then we can pass down into our components. So let's go ahead and start doing that by building our components and then accessing the state. So the first thing we want to do is we want to pass in a nav component here. So actually, before I just write nav here, let's go ahead and create that component. So we'll come up to source, create a new file, call this components, and then we'll create a new file here called nav.js. And here we can just define a really simple component that's going to have two buttons. So first we need to import React. And actually, let's go ahead. I'm just going to copy this code and then talk about what's happening, because this will just be easier for you to follow along, I think. So I'm just going to copy this from the final project. So once I went ahead and pasted that in, let me just talk about really briefly what's going on here. So first, what we did is that we imported useContext from React, and we also imported the initial context that we created at the beginning of the video. And what the reason we did that is because when we call useContext, we need to tell it what context it needs to read off of. And because we define global state and global dispatch in our global state context, or excuse me, our global state provider, we can then read off of those values like this. So now that we define this, we can read off of those here below. So here I have this nav element, and it's saying, hey, is the global state, is the person logged in? And if they're logged in, we then want to have this button that displays log out. Now, once this person clicks on this, what do we want to do to the state? Well, then this is where we call global dispatch, and we're passing in an action, and the value that we're passing in on this action is set to type equals to log out. And what this does is it goes to that reducer that we defined. It says, okay, cool, this is log out. What we want to do is we want to set the state to false. And we essentially just did the same thing here, but the opposite for the login button. So if the user here is not logged in, we want to show the login button. And here, once they click on this button, we want to pass in the login type. And what that's going to do is then set the state to true. So that's all the nav here is doing. So let's go ahead and save that and import it here at the top of our application. Now, another thing I like to do is I like to create an index.js file and export all my components from it. Therefore, we're not, importing all of these on one line. So let's come into our components here, create a new file, call this index.js. Then we can open this index.js file, and we can say export everything from nav. Let's go back into our nav and make sure that we name this right. So export const, cool. And instead of saying to importing this directly from the nav component, we just export or import it from this index.js file. All right. So now that that's cleaned up, the next component we want to create is the download file component. So we're going to put that one right below the download image. Now again, I'm going to come into my component, create a new file here called downloadimage.js. Then come into our index and let's make sure we export this here. So export everything from the download image. Then let's come back into our component. And again, I'm just going to copy this from the final project to save us some time here. And then to talk about what we did. So again, just like our nav, we have to import useContext and then the context that we want to use in that useContext React hook. So here, we actually don't need to dispatch anything because we don't want to change any properties here. We just want to see what they are and then handle how the button should be disabled or not. So here, down here, we have this form that's then wrapped inside a button here where we pass in this disabled value. And what we're doing is we're saying, hey, what is the logged in state? If it's true, then we should not disable this. So in order to get the opposite of that, we pass in this exclamation part, which is a falsy value. So what this means is that, hey, if this person is not logged in, disable this button and make sure that they're not able to click on it. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. We'll come into our index.js, or excuse me, our app.js, and then we can go ahead and import that here. So that's going to be download file, or no, it's going to be download image from our component. And let's make sure I'm going to make sure, it looks like there was an error. I might have named this wrong, so let's do, okay, so download image. There we go. So just had a quick, had a little typo there. All right, so now because this person isn't logged in, we can see that this is disabled. So let's go ahead and check this, click it. All right, so now we're logged in and now the button is no longer disabled. And if we click on it, we can download the image. All right, so now there's just one more thing we need to do, and that is the notification to tell the user to log in if they're not logged in. And to do that, we're just going to create another component here. And this one's going to be called login notification.js. Let's come into our index and make sure we export it here. Come back into our login notification. And here we're doing something a little different. So again, I'm just going to copy the code here. And what I did here is I use styled components in order to pass in this logged in value and then change the CSS because it is a CSS and JS library. Now we're getting an error here because this doesn't exist yet. So let's go ahead and create that right now. So what we want to do is we want to create a new folder here in our source. So we'll call this elements. And we need to create a couple things here. So let's create a new file. Let's do the index.js. So this is going to be similar to how we did it in the components, where you can just import everything directly from this elements folder. And we also want to create a new file here called notification elements.js. Now you don't need to structure your project like this. I just like to create my style components in an elements folder and then keep my actual components in their own components folder. So this is just the way I like to organize my project. All right, so in this notification elements, we want to import styled from styled components. Now right now, we don't have that installed. And the way you would do this if you're using this on your computer is to use something like yarn or npm in order to install that package. But because this is CodeSandbox, we need to come down to add dependency, search for styled components. So this first one here, and then that's going to add this to our project. And then at the top, we can then import styled from styled components. All right, so let's go ahead and create a styled div component. And to do that, we say export const, the name of the div, so login notification wrapper equals styled.div. And here we can write CSS just like we would in any standard CSS file. So what I want to do is set display. And the one thing that's different than standard CSS is that we're able to access props here in the CSS and then conditionally change the CSS values. So first we got to pass in those props. And the props that we're looking at is this prop that we're going to be calling it logged in. So we say logged in. Is this true? If they're logged in, we don't want to show this person this notification. So we want to set it to none. And if they're logged out, we do want to show it. So therefore we'll set it to block. And that's all we're doing here in this notification wrapper. So let's come back to our original component. And the reason we're not seeing this is because we never exported it from this index.js file. So let's make sure we export everything from this. So let's go and save that. All right, so now that we have that, we can come back into our application and make sure that it's here in our app.js file. So let's go down here, and below this download image, we can say the name of the component, which is login notification. Do tab to auto import that, close it off, and now save it. All right, so now we have display is set to block because we're not logged in. So once we click on login, we'll see that that notification then goes away. The disabled is then set to false, and then now we can go ahead and download that image. So this is how you can get started setting up the boilerplate for creating a global state in your React application. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other design and development tutorials on skillthrive.com and on our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and I'll see you in the next video.